I'm going to begin by thanking all the writers who gave craft lectures the previous 2 weeks. They were wonderful. These are some of the best thinkers about writing that I know. Last year, I went first with my craft lecture. So I had the wonderful experience of feeling that it was over and it diminished in importance as the 2 weeks went on. And it was a buoyant feeling. This year I'm last. And the feeling has been greater weight, greater weight, greater weight. That was brilliant. So it may be appropriate that I'm last. There's a valedictory, even elegiac quality to this. So here goes. This is called Becoming and Going, Soul and Self in 4 poems, actually 6 poems. Friends of mine in the poetry world, Claudia Emerson, Bridget Pegeen Kelly, Michelle Boisseau have been getting sick and dying. I hate to think it's that time of life because these departures at any time would be all too soon. Yet I've been lucky to be around young people who are beginning their writing careers and are full of an excitement like being born. And for some reason, coming together in my sense of the world are these 2 things: friends departing, friends arriving. So I'm going to talk today about poems of arrival and departure, poems that recognize the moment one comes into being as a kind of birth, and also recognize that becoming is inevitably followed by going. Hail and farewell, hello and goodbye. Poems of becoming and going, body meeting soul, soul meeting body. Their life together often takes a particular shape on the page, a form which is frequently narrative, either covertly or overtly. It may be a series of impressions, a catalog of incremental growth. It may be the story that extends from an extended metaphor. It may be like Dante's, an allegorical journey. And it may be a short lyric that captures a moment and stops time. 2 short poems have led me to my talk today, and since they are fairly clear, and what I'm going to talk about still is not entirely clear to me, I will begin with them. This talk takes about 45, 46 minutes, so we'll be out in time for lunch. I promise you. Both of these short poems have achieved separate kinds of notoriety. The Emperor Hadrian it is said, to be the author of one. His valediction to his soul on his deathbed, Animula, Vagula, Blandula. It has been translated often, so often, that you have your choice of styles from at least the last 4 centuries. In other words, a classic, and therefore ripe to be plucked for literary allusion. The other is one I read for the first time in the hothouse library of my adolescence when I made my way through all of the novels of Ian Fleming about his deathless and problematic hero, James Bond, and came to the haiku, "You only live twice," in the novel of the same title. If you know the novel, you know that James Bond has composed this on the spot to impress a Japanese associate who is a haiku master. So he supposedly, James Bond, writes, "You only live twice, once when you were born, and once when you looked death in the face." Ian Fleming, the author, claims that this is after Basho, the 17th century Japanese poet, but I have never been able to find the original Basho, that it is supposedly after, and as a haiku, at least in English, syllabically it's off with 19 syllables, nor does it feel right. And the novel it is from can justly be accused of salacious Orientalism. If you know Edward Said's thought, you know what I mean by Orientalism. Still, I'm interested in these 2 experiences of what are called birth and death. The experience of birth, and birth can be figurative, and the experience of death, which also may be figurative. James Bond has looked death in the face many times. I'm going to dismiss his implicit boasting and suggests that he and his creator, Fleming, have come inadvertently, perhaps, on an actual source of wisdom and delight. Actually, I wrote my first paper in college on the novels of Ian Fleming, but for a sociology class, which then was a bad idea. But now maybe not. Both poems, Hadrian's Valediction and Bond's Ersatz Haiku, share that connection, umbilicus or membrane between birth and death, and the heightened sense we develop for ourselves along the way from one to the other, if we are lucky. I think there is a kind of poem, and a formal kind, though not always the same kind, which a poet finds for this story. It is not a poem of epiphany, but one which recognizes that life has a particular form of meaning when we are born, or our sense of self is born, and when we see that we are going to die. Life, which for the newly born is, as William James says, a blooming and buzzing confusion, is, when we are old enough to understand, vividly real when we face death. Even if, like Prospero, every third thought is our grave. We can't live if we spend all our time dwelling on our birth and our death. I think that is why there are not many poems in which the two are considered together as moments of realization. But the kind of poem I am thinking of expresses that amazing sense that soul and body are one. And though they may be severed, a poem is a unique expression of their union. The Emperor Hadrian's farewell to his soul, Animula Vagula Blandula, has not, as Charles Martin wrote to me when I asked him about it, I was hoping Charles would have a translation of it, but he said, no, I've never tried that. But he pointed me to some other translations. He said it has not passed its own immortality on to many of its translators. I do think one or two of them has done a good job, but I'll get to that. The reason it interests me is, first of all, that Hadrian suggests that the soul is not only a bosom friend, but an essential part of his personality, his wit, part consciousness, part conscience. And second, in itself, Hadrian acknowledges a split, which I believe the poems I'm talking about also acknowledge, but one that ultimately cannot exist if we are fully human. Here's the wonderful Stevie Smith's version of Hadrian's deathbed epigram in a rhythm that I think must be trochaic tetrameter, like Philip Larkin's The Explosion and like Longfellow's Hiawatha. Little soul so sleek and smiling, flesh's friend and guest also, where departing will you wander, growing paler now and languid, and not joking as you used to? We may or may not recognize the author of Not Waving but Drowning in this translation. It gives us a clear-eyed sense of valediction to a vital part of oneself, the one that embodies your wit and your sense of humor. Apart from the flesh it occupied, the soul may lose the very qualities that defined it. Without the soul, the body is a dullard. Without the body, the soul goes out like a light. T.S. Eliot's poem, Animula, one of the aerial poems that Faber published at Christmas time in the late 1920s, alludes to Hadrian's poem in its title. So I'm going to read all of that poem now. It should be on your handout. Animula. Issues from the hand of God the simple soul, to a flat world of changing lights and noise, to light, dark, dry, or damp, chilly, or warm, moving between the legs of tables and of chairs, rising or falling, grasping at kisses and toys, advancing boldly, sudden to take alarm, retreating to the corner of arm and knee, eager to be reassured, taking pleasure in the fragrant brilliance of the Christmas tree. Pleasure in the wind, the sunlight, and the sea. Studies the sunlit pattern on the floor and running stags around a silver tray, confounds the actual and the fanciful, content with playing cards and kings and queens, what the fairies do and what the servants say. The heavy burden of the growing soul perplexes and offends more day by day, week by week offends and perplexes more with the imperatives of is and seems, and may not, desire and control, the pain of living and the drug of dreams, curl up the small soul in the window seat behind the Encyclopedia Britannica. Issues from the hand of time the simple soul, irresolute and selfish, misshapen, lame, unable to fare forward or retreat, fearing the warm reality, the offered good, denying the importunity of the blood, shadow of its own shadows, specter in its own gloom, leaving disordered papers in a dusty room, living first in the silence after the viaticum. Pray for Gutierrez, avid of speed and power, for Boudin blown to pieces, for this one who made a great fortune and that one who went his own way. Pray for Flore by the boarhound slain between the yew trees. Pray for us now and at the hour of our birth. I think Eliot wanted us to know Hadrian's poem as we unfolded his deft series of images, his narrative catalog with its combination of Alexander Pope and Walt Whitman, of the way the soul and the body together come to consciousness. After the title, the poem begins with an allusion to Dante from the Purgatorio. The character Marco Lombardo, in the part of Purgatory where the wrathful are purged of their anger, gives this beautiful little disquisition, a kind of catechism here in Eliot's own prose translation. I'm afraid that you don't have that, so this is how Eliot translates the passage. From the hands of him who loves her before she is, there issues like a little child that plays with weeping and laughter, the simple soul, that knows nothing except that, come from the hands of a glad Creator, she turns willingly to everything that delights her. First, she tastes the flavor of a trifling good, then is beguiled and pursues it, if neither guide nor check withhold her. Therefore laws were needed as a curb, a ruler was needed, who should at least see afar the tower of the true city. Dante's phrase is l'anima semplicita. Animula is Hadrian's word. One has to be careful about attributing Marco Lombardi's speech to Dante himself, as with attributing speeches from the plays to Shakespeare. Marco is being punished, actually cleaned or purged, for his anger in this section of Purgatory. What he says about the birth of the childlike feminine soul may not be altogether orthodox, though Eliot, in his own purgatorial period, may have meant to mirror Marco Lombardo in his poems as not completely on target but well-meaning. Nothing I have found out about Hadrian's poem, however, extant when Dante wrote, suggests that Dante knew it. This is Eliot's play alone. After a reference to a witty epigram from a Roman emperor, the poem is launched with a reference to Dante, issues from the hand of God, the simple soul. With allusions that are a trademark of Eliot's modernism and Christianity, the poem moves through a catalog of increasingly complex responses to the world, from birth, infancy, childhood, adolescence, a word for growing, and the leap to the understanding of death, and by it, the recognition of others, their lives, their fates. The world of Eliot's growing soul grows less concrete and more abstract, so that the last actual recognizable thing is that volume of the Encyclopedia Britannica with the small soul curled up behind it in a window seat. It also appears that as the soul becomes a heavy burden, more impaired, less adept, irresolute and selfish, misshapen, lame, halting, it turns abstract at the moment of its own demise, and as if for the first time since it issued into the world, alive. Of course, this is T.S. Eliot, living in the ruins of his first marriage and trying as much as possible to understand the nature of his own soul during a time when he grew increasingly monastic. He wrote some memorable verses at this time, including Ash Wednesday and Journey of the Magi, and this poem, Animula. But he also wrote some not-so-good poems for the Ariel series, like The Cultivation of Christmas Trees, which he described as better doctrine than it was verse. Doctrine seemed preeminent in any case. I'm not as interested in the doctrine of Animula as I am in the narrative of the soul's coming to life and the possibility that the poem starts twice, perhaps 3 times. The poem advances through 3 complete sentences, the first 15 lines, then the next 8 lines, and another 8, which end at line 31, and then we go on to the envoy at the last 6. The poem's last 6 lines are a kind of envoy and come out of nowhere. The soul experiences a barrage of the senses, given in the poem as a series of parallel statements, a catalog, which in the first 15 lines is pretty wonderful. Something to put beside Jacques' speech in the 7 Ages, on the 7 Ages of Man and As You Like It, and the beginning of W.B. Yeats's autobiography. Also come to mind any number of catalogs in the poems of Alexander Pope, and, as if wearing Pope as a disguise, passages from Song of Myself. The catalog itself is very possibly meant to suggest simultaneity, apparent growth, apparent living till one's death, all at the same time. The actual images are sparsely distributed, table and chairs, kisses and toys, arm and knee, but the fragrant brilliance of the Christmas tree looms from childhood in its synesthesia, a combination of the 2 senses, fragrant of smell and light or sight, looms from childhood even over the stags on the silver tray and may be matched only by that encyclopedia volume, or at the end of the poem's first part, the disordered papers in a dusty room. With its 15 lines, then 8 lines and 8 lines, with its occasional rhyme, so occasional you hardly hear them, until lines 27 through 31, with good, blood, gloom, room, viaticum. The poem may be an exploded sonnet. It argues that we grow more abstract until we die and death makes us a concrete fact again. Life ends at line 31, but the poem makes a wonderful leap to its last 6 lines, its envoy or sestet, echoing the Ave Maria. 3 names are invoked: Gutierrez, Boudin, Flore. Continental, as the English Eliot might have thought, and 2 clear fates: Boudin is blown to pieces and Flore slain by a boarhound like Actaeon, but between yew trees. Each line reads like an epitaph. And the purpose of the Ave Maria, to petition the Virgin's care at our deaths, is turned into an appeal to her to pray for us now and at the hour of our birth. The creation of simultaneity like that will come back in T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets with the famous refrain, "In my end is my beginning." Animula flirts with rhyme, but in no predictable pattern, as it flirts with the form of a sonnet, but more as Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach does. We may be hearing iambic pentameter, which we are much of the time, except when we're not. He's a modernist. All of the emphasis is on the possible symbolic significance of things and allusions, even at the point of syntax, that chiasmus a la Alexander Pope in lines 17 and 18, perplexes and offends more day by day, week by week, offends and perplexes more. Eliot flirts with rhyme throughout the poem's first 31 lines in iambic pentameter, but he cared for the sonnet as little as he cared for Whitman. Nevertheless, I detect both the sonnet and Whitman in Animula, and in particular, Whitman's cataloging awareness that all things in a list are equal, democratically on the same level. Eliot, despite being a monarchist and a Tory, has followed a form here in which the soul's sense of the world is of the same value at every step, or rather, the simple or complex is the same soul, issuing from the hand of God or the hand of time. But what about that? What about that reiteration of line 1 and line 24? The simple soul that issues from the hand of God in line 1 experiences much of the conditioning of childhood as it grows more complicated, perplexing, and grows heavier and seeks escape. But the modification of line 24, so that the simple soul issues from the hand of time, what about it? This soul seems to be a stunted one, deformed, perhaps by original sin, incapable of experience, afraid of reality even when warm and good, and dying in a kind of monastic stagnation, living only after the last rites, the viaticum, are administered. I wonder if Eliot is talking about the same soul or even the same creator. We are led via a series of increments to understand that the soul grows up and can find living painful and seek escape through dreams and reading. That seems familiar. That seems reasonable. Still, it is quite a turn or reversal to bring that section of the poem to an end at the viaticum for the soul, its final journey, and then transition or leap to the envoy with its list of names and fates, and finally the petition to Mary, or perhaps keeping Whitman in mind, even, please God, Emily Dickinson, it is a petition to the reader. For we may all be included in the request for prayers. Liturgy here may have more to do with the democratic vista than with courtly hierarchy. Eliot's own resistance to and horror of experience, fearing the warm reality, and denying the importunity of the blood seem to occur as aspects of that second simple soul created by time. One of his biographers dwells on this image of a child curled up alone in a window seat with a volume of Britannica and considers it as a desolate image of Eliot's own childhood. He was a youngest child of parents who had much older children. So in effect, an only child. But even Eliot knows, as he shows in poem after poem, that the greater desolation is to refuse what the world offers, though what the world offers leads inevitably to dissatisfaction. I don't think we would care about this poem, if we care about it at all, though, without its envoy, its last 6 lines. Whitman was the great poet of awakening consciousness, and one of the poems of Whitman's I have in mind is Out of the Cradle, Endlessly Rocking. And even if Eliot and Ezra Pound dismissed Whitman, we can see his presence here with our own eyes. The best way to chart the growth of the soul is possibly through a catalog of its experiences from birth to death. When the Virgin is implored to pray for us in the Catholic liturgy, it is at the hour of our death. Here, aptly, it is at the hour of our birth. But Gutierrez, Boudin, and Fleury are represented only by their names and their fates, the others simply by the directions of their lives. They're not folded into an argument as they would be in a sonnet, or laid out in a narrative as they would be in a dramatic poem or an epic. Christopher Ricks reports that Eliot more than once demurred on the meaning of the name Boudin, saying he was surprised to learn that in French the word meant black pudding, a kind of blood sausage. And if he had known, he would never have bestowed the name on the friend he was thinking of. I don't buy it. Eliot was fluent in French and wrote poems in French. And behind the name is a grisly fact that is Boudin's destiny, like a blood sausage to be blown to pieces. The little soul of wit is not inclined to be nice, which is why Hadrian will miss him. Eliot did have a sense of humor. He had a wicked one. And as much as he may seem to be depicting his own crippled soul here as representative or universal, he is not above making a sordid joke. His envoy acknowledges others and their fates, no matter how grim and graphic, but immunizes them in a way by asking for the intercessory prayers of the Virgin. Animula is one of Eliot's most interesting and complicated poems because he isn't quite sure of where he is in terms of Christian doctrine, a good thing for poetry, and its narrative provides a way of imagining how a soul, let's say a person, comes to be in more ways than we can count. We're going to look at the Mona Van Dyne poem now. That's next. From the high modernist symbolism of Eliot to the kitchen sink realism of Mona Van Dyne may seem disorienting, but also a return to sea level from a rarefied atmosphere, a relief. And yet we're in the presence of a much more formal organization, only one in which the seams have all been hidden. This is the delivery. I'm 5. The petals of my timeless play can unfurl while mother hoes out other gardens. The next door child and I alone with my toys, confined to the dining room, our discreet noise. From the doorway, Betty, come here. The uprooted flower falls dead with no warning. What had my friend done? Rolled a dime store car over the tabletop? Stood on a chair to wave the little dust mob? I will never know. She is tethered to mother's hand, and mother's voice begins the long scolding. I start a soldier's march around and around the table, stomping each foot to stomp out her sound. Faster around, I stomp until it is over. Betty is gone, and mother takes hold of me. What's the matter with you? Why is your face so red? Why, you're crying. Your whole face is dripping wet. Well, if that isn't silly, I'd like to know what is. I wasn't scolding you. I was scolding Betty. She laughs. Go wash your face. The room blears. My hand wipes and finds all the unfelt tears. Soon it is supper time. In the kitchen they feed and talk while I, invisible as I was in high chair days, silently sit on sears, wearing my weight of big and bigger ears. Well, you'll never guess what your crazy kid did today. If that wasn't the limit, the story swells into ache in my stomach when Dad's laughter and hers slice and tear like knives and forks, and a worse hurt is opening in my middle. In familiar smells and muddle of voices, mashed potatoes, dimming light hamburger, thick creamed corn, the milk-white chill, a self is being born, and is swept away through seething clots of minnow in the nearby hidden creek that weeps through the meadow, smeared with mud from its suckling roots of willow, to tributary, to river, deep and slow, whose sob-like surges quietly lift her and carry her unjudged freight clear to the morning sea. And there they are, all of the heavy others, even mother and father, the floundering, floating, or sinking human herd, whose arm strokes frail, awry, frantic, hold up their heads to inhale the sky, which gilds the tongues of water or soothes them to stillness, with white silk covers strewn with onyx and pearl. She is with them, inept dog paddler that she is. The heavens whirl and drift their weightless riches through streaky splendors of joy, or bear unending loads of blazing or ice blue clarity. With them all. She is scraped by crusted rock, wrenched by tides untrue to heart or to clock, fighting the undertow to shapelessness in smothering deeps to what is insufferable. If those she can reach go under, she cannot save them. How could she save them? Omnipotent dark has seized them. She can only sink with each one as far as light can enter, meet drowning eyes and flesh still spangled with tiny gems from above, a sign of the rare her watered eyes never need. Pointing to where, up, in the passionate strain, lives everything fair, before she flails back to the loved, the illumined air. The delivery actually veils its verse form in loose pentameter lines where we might hear a rhyme occasionally, but as far as I can tell, it is constructed of 15 quatrains, which rhyme A, B, C, C, until the turn at the 9th quatrain, in which all 4 lines rhyme. Then the scheme inverts to A, A, B, C, until the 15th and last quatrain, in which, like the 9th, all the lines rhyme. I'm talking about this poem because its extended metaphor of a self being born grows out of the occasion for that birth and offers a form for this story, just as Eliot's catalog provides one. The care with which Van Dyne has constructed, then hidden, she's just incredible, or submerged her effects reminds me of something I heard about Steve Jobs' idea of craftsmanship once, that even the insides of his gadgets were to be elegant, beautiful. The delivery is the last poem of her final book, Firefall. The poem's title refers both to her birth as a poet and to her eventual escape from her family. The poem extends from the memory of an incident in childhood when a friend she is playing with at home is suddenly and for no apparent reason scolded by her mother. The sense of time and place as the poem begins is almost as ambiguous as it is in Animula. Yet timelessness is abruptly suspended, uprooted, by the mother's mysterious berating of the friend Betty. With her command, "Betty, come here," the situation takes on a clarity that makes it all the more memorable. However, the poet has already suggested that she has some sense of her mother's power, for while her mother gardens, if that's what she's literally doing, their play is confined to the dining room, and their noise is discreet. She remembers her peculiar response as her mother scolded her friend, marching like a soldier around the dining table, stomping out her mother's voice. When the mother turns her attention to Mona, herself, she discovers she's been crying and scolds her for responding to the scolding of the other child. Later, during supper, the mother tells the father, "Well, you'll never guess what your crazy kid did today, if that wasn't the limit." I don't think this memory of her parents' behavior could count as a memory of abuse. I'm revising that in my mind. More and more it seems as if it is. But the poem does record a wound, a psychic wound, and implicitly compares it to a kind of cesarean section which will result in the birth of a self. It is interesting to note that she doesn't write that the two parents eat, rather they feed, while the attentive child, invisible, listens with the weight of my big and bigger ears. As the mother mocks her sympathy, the poet takes the moment to where a poem of mere grievance might end. There's a reasonable resolution to this remembered, ordinary, insensitive act of parents who were being merely thoughtless, although other poems by Van Dyne give us a sense of their callous self-centeredness with regard to their daughter as well as each other. A self is being born, but so is the poet, maker of extended metaphors, and all are swept away through seething clots of minnow. The poem extends past its occasion, changing narrative to metaphor, employing the flow of water that starts with her mysterious tears and, like Alice's tears in Wonderland, form a freshet that flows to the sea as a form for its figure, beginning in the literal, the nearly hidden creek that weeps through the meadow, and extending to tributary to river deep and slow, clear to the morning sea. Is that enough? No, for she imagines the humanity with that newly born self, whose lives, like Betty's, with whom she will find herself moving. Nor does Van Dyne depict the poet as heroine, rescuer of the past, recording angel, talented survivor, even though we may infer those roles for her. She too is trying to keep her head above water as she recognizes the terrible and beautiful, the sublime nature of their progress. The poet's delivery has been from what was insufferable. She has escaped a suffocating and soul-killing world with its formless muddle of food, mashed potatoes, hamburger, thick cream corn, all in the milk-white chill of the emotionally frigid household. She is fully aware of that escape, having begun at that moment in her childhood when her own simple soul begins its growth and lifts her and carries her unjudged freight clear to the morning sea. She can only go so far with those sinking or dying before she has to flail back to the loved, the illumined air. Weight and weightlessness, shape and shapelessness are as much aspects of the poem's symbolism as they are in Animula. The difference is that they are part of the extended metaphor's narrative. Actions methodically mentioned, one following the other, but with the hyper-reality of a dream. The sky gilds the tongues of water or soothes them to stillness, with white silk covers strewn with onyx and pearl. Above the beauty of the surface, with its sustaining air, the heavens whirl and drift their weightless riches through streaky splendors of joy or bare, unending loads of blazing or ice-blue clarity. Big difference between milk-white chill and blazing or ice-blue clarity, but we can make the connection and see how imagination has created and joined them both. It is the undertow to shapelessness that the newborn self has to fight in smothering deeps. Others, like the parents, may be sinking there, seized by the omnipotent dark, but she has been there already. She has come from there, or a place like it, and will struggle up from there, even as an inept dog paddler, to the surface of her life and the air which for herself and soul are illumined and fair. As the birth of the poet poem, the delivery has quite a lineage. What I like about it partly is that, like Animula, it places us first in an unpromising domestic space with no mighty forms or gutter nostalgia to elevate it. From a child's seat on a Sears Roebuck catalog, we are launched into a visionary world. The poet Michel Boisseau, my friend, died last November, 2 years after being given a diagnosis of cancer which predicted she had only months, even weeks, to live. A number of the poems in her final book, Among the Gorgons, show her determination to survive. However, the following poem has more to do with the experience of looking death in the face and seeking a means to describe that experience. This is the obstinate comedy. In the middle of my life, I lost my way. I knew my turn was coming around the bend, and there it was. The crows calling over the shoulders of trees stretched the space wider and wider, like the circles a focal dragonfly sends around itself on a pond. But ahead of me, something was taking up all the space. It was dark and slippery, like things that don't breathe, and it was so humongous I couldn't see how close it was or get a feel for its edges. The thing was, there was no straight way, no mythic down and down a spiraling code to climb up and over a frozen stiff and into a night freshly laid with the standard stars. My way had turned into a knot polished smooth as a platitude, and I was to lie down in front of it, stupid and stymied by malignancy. Standing there with my way nobbled, my life, which is all I have to go on, seemed odd as a word turned over and over until it hatches into shatters. By turns, the tongue in my mouth was a frog jinking against my palate, or a wad of soggy pulp. You can't talk your way out of this impasse, said the crows. You can't hold in the rings of time, said the trees, switching their branches. And the knot? Naturally, it was mum. Obsidian and vitreous, it gleamed like a symbol, while the tumored forerunners crabbed my lungs. Breathe deep, turn the tides inside you. In the middle of my life, I lost my way, or was it more toward the end? And I wandered an abrupt, gigantic day. I saw the trees were upside-down waterfalls, and the crows were flying veins of air. Each crow shook its singular crow history, each tree a history of flying in space, a congress of beetles and mushrooms, which are the fruit of a tree that grows underground. Like Eliot, Boisseau turns to Dante for a starting point, but with a difference. She appropriates Dante's narrative form as a way to show her bewilderment and fearless humor in facing death, but without Dante's Christian allegory. In Dante's poem, as you remember, he finds himself in the middle of his life in a dark wood where he diverges from the true path. He spends an entire Easter weekend getting himself back on track, with lots of help from saints and sinners along the way. Boisseau believes she has also lost her way, though not in any theological sense. She knows, as I expect we all know, that her turn is coming around the bend, and her sense is that she has lost the chance to keep going, and now feels as if she were wandering strangely in place. The sequential time of her life, its chronology, has become an abrupt, gigantic day. Unlike Dante, she has encountered no second chance. In the middle of my life, she writes, I lost my way, or was it more toward the end? The knot of the cancer itself is in the middle of her way, or it has become the way, since it is a stubborn obstacle which equals her own obstinacy. My way had turned into a knot polished, smooth as a platitude, and I was to lie down in front of it, stupid and stymied by malignancy. The forward progress of her life is brought to a halt, and the Ptolemaic rings Dante could depend on for his cosmology are, for this poem, like circles a focal dragonfly sends around itself on a pond, stretching wider and wider. Her life is all she has to go on, and it has been wound into that knot, and smooth as a platitude, turned into a kind of cliche before which she is expected to give in. Dante had the undergirding of medieval Christianity, as fully structured and realized a belief system as one can imagine, to invest his bewildering trouble with meaning and resolve the dilemma of his comedy. It wasn't Dante, by the way, who called his poem divine, but its happy ending is meant to be divine. In Boisseau's comedy, she knew her turn was coming around the bend, and there it was. It's tragic that the expected has come so soon. But the comedy inheres in her obstinacy. What can she do but show a stubbornness to match her dilemma and make a poem about it in which the comedy of allegory is clearly not the point? Eliot might have called this whistling past the graveyard, as he does, about the speeches of tragic heroes in Shakespeare, trying to cheer themselves up, he says. Boisseau acts to imagine her dilemma not as tragic, but with a kind of earthly beauty, obsidian and vitreous, gleaming like a symbol. And that by trying to breathe deep, she can turn the tides inside her, except the tides are cramped in her lungs, and the knot winding her into it is not a symbol, even as an image in a poem, if only it were. Dante's great allegorical form provides a way to speak of this journey, but Boisseau reminds us that speaking itself is tricky. Her tongue, a wad of soggy pulp or a frog, jinking against my palate. Not to be facetious, because I couldn't possibly match Boisseau's gift for facetiousness, even in the face of her own mortality, but her disease is certainly Boisseau's opportunity to display her colloquial invention and her subtle erudition, to write, as I believe J.D. Salinger once said, with all your stars out. So, that something taking up all the space before her is so humongous. And when she explains the thing was, there was no straight way, no mythic down, and no spiraling code to climb up and over a frozen stiff and into a night freshly laid with the standard stars, she alludes to the departure of Dante and Virgil from hell, up the shaggy frozen body of Satan, through the center of the earth to the stars at the antipodes. She buries in the allusion to Dante another allusion, this one to the crucial deformation of DNA, the code, which has spiraled into the knot of cancer. Saying there was no way, she keeps her eye on the form she is employing, the tercets of the Commedia, and Dante's allegory with its levels of meaning. Would that it were all allegorical. That's the kind of poem she would like to write. But you can't talk your way out of this impasse, the crows tell her frankly, and you can't hold in the rings of time, say the candid trees. Her life, brought to a halt, to a kind of horizontal circling, looks as if it were turned back on itself, so that she turns Dante's narrative form back on itself too. Hers is a circling that neither descends nor ascends. It is a series of widening circles on a pond which eventually disappear. In Boisseau's poem, the only thing left of the terza rima of Canto 1 of Dante's Inferno is its shadow. As a shadow, it ends raggedly in the last 6 lines with an inversion of the creation story and an underground tree of uninviting fruit, beetles and mushrooms. The meaning is all on the surface now. The poet has come to the end of her life when she thought she was in the middle. Without Dante's poem, we wouldn't have Boisseau's. Without extended metaphor, we wouldn't have Van Dyne's poem. Without the catalog, Pope style or Whitman style, or even Baudelaire style, both Van Dyne and Eliot owe a debt to the French symbolists. We wouldn't have Eliot's poem. These forms grow vitally from their occasions, and those occasions have to do with vitality and mortality, life and death, from being born to starting to die. Form is an enduring legacy, and each of these poems testifies to its narrative shape. This past semester, I shared with the graduate poetry workshop at Vanderbilt, where I teach, poems I was thinking of talking about in this craft lecture, and tried to articulate why they interested me. By the end of the semester, with the class's help, I had recognized that I wanted to talk about a poem which would depict the coming to consciousness of birth or death or both in an expressive form. At the same time, I wanted to find poems in which there was not too much knowingness, and certainly no heroics on the part of the author, who would be still in the thrall of a dawning realization without any of the posturing or acrobatics or complicated yoga positions of the Epiphany. Apologies to yoga followers. It's a wonderful practice. In one of our last classes, when we came to the following poem, this is the last one on your handout, by Sophia Stid, and had a long, interesting ceremony of consideration and dissection to see if the poem would survive, one member of the class, Sidney Devereaux, said, almost sotto voce, that I should include this poem in my talk, and that is what I'm going to do. This is lexical gap. Before I knew I had a body, did I have one? Not have. There's no verb for what I mean, no word for this consentless repetition. We never asked to be made like this, all clatter, all fragile. Ghost of the heart dimming in and out like headlights of a car down a long curve of road. Watching from a distance, we can see how every now and then everything illuminates. We can't know when or if it will ever come again, or how. This is my body, we say, Sundays, but we don't own it. I had a body without knowing it once. I was a body small enough to sleep tucked in a plastic laundry basket. I don't mean have or was. No verb, no word, but here I am, meaning it. This 13-line poem, a sonnet, as I would argue it is, insists on what the other poems have only hinted at. There is no verb and no word, the meaning of the word verb. For that moment that you see you are your body, and yet know there was an earlier time when you were unconscious of that, though you often have proof, say a story or family picture, that you were once small enough to sleep in a plastic laundry basket, or curl up behind an encyclopedia volume, or perch on a Sears Roebuck catalog, or just fit inside your life comfortably. The sonnet form itself, though it may use narrative as part of its argument, tends to stop time, suspend it, in a state of recognition or contemplation. That is certainly what Stid's sonnet does, and without a conventional 14th line, not to mention other missing conventions, it manages to create a radiant concentration on images of birth and death, arrival and departure, and the presence of experience, challenging language, and the poet's way with words. Conscience and consciousness may not be synonymous, but they need each other if anything is going to get said. Consciousness awakes us to life, but conscience connects us to language. Eliot knows this, Van Dyne, Boisseau, Hadrian, and the dependency of consciousness and conscience appears to be what Stid has recognized. There may be neither verb nor word for their connection, though Boisseau comes up with some choice ones, like humongous and jinking. The recognition that one has been born is equal to the recognition that one is going to die. And the kind of poem I've been talking about tries to express that equality, the consciousness which is given expression by conscience. I'm nearly finished. W.H. Auden once wrote, taking his terms from The Tempest and the wizard Prospero and his familiar spirit Ariel, that there are Prospero poets and poems which are occupied with wisdom, and Ariel poets and poems which take delight for their subjects. I'm talking about a kind of poem in which Prospero and Ariel share the same island, as they do in Shakespeare's play, occupy the same haunted space, boundaried by a gigantic day which may be death or may simply be the sense of being alive. Poets always want to find the word for this, and sometimes, as in Sophia Stid's poem, that word meaning is the only verb and noun, the only word. To be is to mean. I know what Archibald MacLeish says in Ars Poetica, a poem must not mean but be, and I hope that what I am saying is more inclusive, but not all that different. To be is to mean. Christ, obliquely referenced in Stid's sonnet, this is my body, we say, knew that to be was to mean. Before and after you know you have a body. And though it will seem ingenious and possibly obvious, the poem's body is its form, right? And here in these poems, the form embodies a particular meaning. And I know I am guilty of redundancy, tautology, and circular reasoning, since every poem could be said to enact this coming together of body and soul. But it is a particular poem, like the ones I have discussed today, that makes that coming together the occasion for its own existence as a poem. The sense that makes these poems unique and memorable is being alive, even when death is impending, alive at the confluence of arrival and departure. Thank you.